Hey guys, welcome to RG3 Tech Talk. In previous session, we had a brief overview of the component based architecture. In this session, we can get into the details of it. So, what is a component? Components are independent and reusable bits of code. A component is one of the core building blocks of React. In other words, we can say that every application you will develop in React will be made up of pieces called components. Components make the task of building UIs much easier. In older days, the developers write more than thousands of lines of code for building a single page application. These applications follow the traditional DOM structure, and making changes in them was a very big challenging task. If any mistake found, it manually searches the entire application and update accordingly. The component based approach was introduced to overcome of this issue. In this approach, the entire application is divided into a small logical group of code which is known as components. In this picture, we can say that we have 5 components: header component, side nav component, main content component, footer component, and finally one root component which holds all other 4 components. All the components come together to make up the entire application, and this is called a root component. These components also can be reusable. For example, the left side nav can be also used as a right side nav as well. And a component can contain other components. In ReactJS, we have mainly 2 types of components. They are functional components and class components. Now that we have seen what functional and class components are, let's look at some differences between them. Functional components are written as JavaScript function. Class components are written as a JavaScript class. Functional components do not have a state or lifecycle methods. Class components have a state and can implement lifecycle methods like component did mount and component did update. Functional components faster as they do not have state and lifecycle. React needs to do less work to render these components. Class components are slower than comparing with functional components as they have state and lifecycle. React needs to do comparatively more work to render these components. Functional components tend to shorter and more concise. Class components require the boilerplate code such as a constructor method and the use of this to access props and state. Functional components do not use this at all, which makes them easier to understand for beginners. Class components use the this keyword is used to refer to the current instance of the component, which can be confusing for new developers. Now we can discuss each component in detail. Functional components. In React, functional components are a way to write components that only contain a render method and do not have their own state. They are simply JavaScript functions that may or may not receive data as parameters. We can create a function that takes the props or properties as input and return what should be rendered. A valid functional component can be shown in the below example. This React component accepts a single object argument and returns a React element. Note that an element in React is not a component, but a component is comprised of multiple elements. Class components. Class components are more complex than functional components. It requires you to extend from React components and create a render function which returns a React element. You can pass data from one class to other class components. You can create a class by defining a class that extends component and has a render function. Valid class components is shown in the below example. The class component is also known as a stateful component because they can hold or manage local state. Similarly, class components are basic classes that are made up of multiple functions. All class components of React are subclasses of React.component class. Hence, a class component must always extend it. Now, we will be creating two components by using functional and class components. To make it simple, I am going to remove all the code from app.js file except the container div. Just select it and remove. Now, I am going to create a new folder called components inside source folder. Inside component, I will be creating one more file called functional component.js file. Let's import React. Import React from React. Now let's create a new function. Function, I will be creating function name also as functional component parenthesis, and I will be returning the HTML inside this function. Return, I will be mentioning as this is functional component. And to use this, we need to export this component. Let's use export default and functional component. Now, to use this function, we need to go to the app.js file, and first we need to import React here as well. Import React from React. Now we need to import the component which we have created. Import functional component from components and functional component. Next, we need to use this component inside our app. So if you are using only one line, there is no need of parenthesis. If you are going to use more than one line or multiple lines, we need to use parenthesis, and inside we are going to call that functional component. Functional component, close it. That's it. Now we will be checking in the browser. Yes, this we can, now we have already successfully created functional component. Now we are going to create class component. Just to do that, as earlier, we will be creating new file called class component.js file. So whenever we create a class component, we need to include two imports. First one was import React and component from React. Now we need to define a class. Class component extends component, and inside it, as a second step, class has to implement render method, render, and inside it you need to return HTML. Return this is class component. Now, as like earlier, we need to export this function, this component, export default class component. To use this, just go to app.js file and first you need to import class component from class component. Now let's use this inside app. Class component, just self close this tag. Now check for output here. So we have two components inside one component. This is functional component and this is class component.